Okay, so welcome back everybody, the last session. So I wanted to say a couple things. At the end of last session, we had the continuing question about different ways of approaching the truth. And as I say, this is not something to which I have a definite answer, but a few things that occurred to me. One is just to remember always there's a statement by Nagarjuna himself that some of you might know. In the 13th chapter of his wisdom, Nagarjuna says that for the purpose of dispelling all wrong views, the victors have taught this emptiness. So for those who adhere dogmatically to emptiness, their disease is incurable. So the point being that the purpose of emptiness is to liberate us from our fixed views of things. So then if we have a fixed dogmatic view of emptiness, then there's no cure, because we already are using what is the cure for the dogmatic view as a dogmatic view. So I think in that regard, we have to be careful to distinguish this philosophy, as the Buddha compared it to a raft. It takes us to the other shore. But we don't have to want to confuse the philosophy for where we're going. We have to distinguish in our own practice, in our own study, from what we philosophically believe, or especially what we believe because somebody else tells us it's true, from what we've actually experienced directly. So I mentioned, for example, yesterday, that really, when it comes down to this teaching of the Mahayana, that the Mahayana sutras were taught by the Buddha, a very large part of my confidence in that is that His Holiness the Dalai Lama says they were. So I recognize that this is something I don't have a lot of certainty about. I tend to think there's something to what His Holiness is saying, but it's certainly something that I'm open to debate about, because even if it is true, it's something that certainly I could use a better, firmer grasp of. And so it's important to be open to criticism about these views. So likewise, when we talk about, within Buddhism, first of all, for those of us who adhere to the Tsongkhapa system, Geluk system, if we have then the view that the Sakya view, Gorampa, is wrong, then it can become quite dogmatic. Now, in a debate, I would debate against the Sakya. And actually, this year we had an interesting experience at the winter debate session at Ganden Monastery last year in January. In the middle, late at night, we were having a group debate with my classmates, and a monk passed by, sort of older, maybe in his mid-40s. And he challenged us. He said, "I'm a Sakya, and I don't believe that there's a conventional establishment," which is a heretical view as a Geluk. So he said, "Do you want to debate with me?" So then he sat down with my 40 classmates, and I were debating him. So this, it was a friendly debate, but obviously it got quite heated. It's a way to sharpen our understanding, because he said a lot of things that we'd never heard anyone say before as an answer. And I think we also debated him at some point that he probably hadn't thought of before, which was very helpful for both sides to get a clear understanding of our view. But then at a deeper level, we have great Sakya masters. For example, His Holiness Sakya Tridzen. Now, there's the current Sakya Tridzen, and also his father, the Trizur, the former head of the Sakya school. So I have not received any teachings from the current one, but the previous one, who's now retired, I've received quite a few teachings from him and consider him one of my teachers. So how do I resolve that with the fact that, as a follower of Tsongkhapa, I believe Gorampa's views are wrong? So I think, again, this has to do with how I would debate something versus recognizing there might be something deeper, because certainly with this His Holiness Sakya Trizur Rinpoche, I believe he's a realized being. So somehow he got there some other way. And I think this is what I'm trying to point out, that, it's certainly philosophically, I would debate with a lot of people from not other Buddhist traditions, but other religions. But I do recognize there's definitely something there, that people are having some kind of realization. And even within other religions, we talk about Creator God, but there is certainly a variation in views in that. Actually, the common view today is a lot more simplistic than a lot of the very subtle views that were developed in the past. It's a bit funny in some sense that now, with the advent of science, some people become more fundamentalist and adhere to very characterized views of who God is. But some of the more traditional views are very non-dualistic, much closer to an understanding of something ineffable, not some kind of person in the sky, old man in the sky, but very subtle. And as I mentioned, in Buddhism, we have Dharmakirti's works, which I think quite conclusively negate a lot of the views of the current Vedic schools, the Samkhya and Vaisheshika especially. However, after Dharmakirti passed away, later there was the scholar Shankara, who had a much subtler view, which actually was heavily influenced by Nagarjuna and other Buddhist philosophers, and was never negated by any Buddhist philosopher simply because he arose too late. So to take that Dharmakirti negated the Samkhya view, and therefore all Vedic schools are negated, is a bit too gross a course of a view. And likewise, even the Vaisheshika school, it seems actually as a result of Dharmakirti's debates, they modified their view. And the current Vaisheshika school, which still exists in India, is actually modified and much subtler than the old view. So not so long ago, there was a debate between some Buddhist scholars and some Vaisheshika scholars in Varanasi, and it seems that the Vaisheshika scholars won the debate. I think in large part because the Buddhist scholars were a bit uninformed. They were debating them based on the 6th century Vaisheshika view. They hadn't updated themselves to how the Vaisheshika school has adapted. So it's very important, not to just assume that we have the right view, but always to be challenging that with other ways of seeing things. And then also, even within that, to recognize that philosophy is only an approximation, as we have from Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'm sure many of you know this famous phrase, that there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt up in your philosophy. That we have to be open that there could be a lot more to existence that we don't see and that we're not aware of yet, and be open to the possibility that these views are provisional. And this is what Nagarjuna is talking about in some sense, that in this first turning of the wheel, the Buddha was giving teachings to people based on their capacity. It doesn't mean it was necessarily how he himself saw things. And Nagarjuna is indicating that actually the Buddha was hinting at a deeper truth, which he later elucidated more clearly in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So could so many views within Buddhism be an interference to there being no fixed view? Is this? Well, yeah. So I think we have to be careful again. As I say, there's a difference between being open to different philosophical views and then being philosophically sloppy, which I think would mean, as I said the first day, kind of having the view that they're all the religions are saying the same thing and they're basically just different ways of wording it. We have to be very precise and be very careful not to say, oh, this is, yeah, I just agree with it. It's kind of a, an vague comment. So, philosophically, we can argue that this view is right and this view is wrong, and I can argue for it. But as I said, as the example, if I have the view that I have found a cure for cancer, and maybe I have, but that's not the answer to every question. If somebody then asks me, how do I build a just society? And I say, well, I cured cancer, so listen to me. That my answer to how to cure cancer doesn't necessarily have any bearing on how to build a just society. So just because I have the right answer to one question at a particular time might not be the right answer to every question. So I think, yeah, I will actually talk about this more as we go through this talk. Yeah, what does it mean not to have a fixed view? Because this is something actually that the Geluks also take on. There's the Nagarjuna does say, and we'll come to this in the text, about not having a fixed view. And some people interpret this to mean that he has no view at all. He has no opinion about anything. And Tsongkhapa says this is a big misinterpretation. There's definitely, he has certain opinions. When he says he has no view, he's saying he doesn't have the view of an inherent, an extreme view, that things either exist inherently or don't exist at all. But we will come to that as we go through this talk. So I think let's return to the slides now, if you all have. We were at slide 76. Let's see. Slide 76, the faults of adhering to aggregates, section 4. So we're coming toward the end of the text now. So we've talked about, first of all, the first section was about the extremes, presenting the view free of extremes, which was sort of the heart of the text, the main point that's being made. And then as a corollary to that, then negating the two extremes, showing what's wrong with the extreme of birth, or the extreme of impermanence, and the extreme of destruction, a nihilistic view. And then thirdly, then trying to establish that this was actually what the Buddha was teaching when he taught the Four Noble Truths, even though it didn't, to ordinary appearances, it might have seemed that he was saying things exist inherently, that he had a deeper meaning. So now we come to the question of what is wrong with believing that aggregates exist inherently, that generally cause and effect and karmic cause and effect exists inherently. Isn't it a good view in some sense to think that, yeah, there's karma and I'm reborn, therefore I create positive actions and avoid negative actions. So what's wrong with having that view? So then slide 77, verse 40. Not amazing that other sects profound inherence. Proponents of existence live, adhering to things as supreme. If they abide on just this path, no slight astonishment in that. So Nagarjuna is saying that the non-Buddhist sects, such as, especially he names Samkhya, which I talked about earlier, and then the Vaisesika, which was founded by, we have here, Kumarila, who is the opponent that Dharmakirti debated against. The Vaisesika school in India, the propounders of particulars, who live adhering to things as supreme, meaning that they have their view is that things, talked about Plato, and I said Plato's view is very similar to this. The Vaisesika view is that all things that exist have a particular ideal behind them. So, for example, I talked to this abilities. So, for example, we have the meaning generality of a horse. A final picture of a horse. That I talked about when we have a picture in a mental image of something. What appears to me, when I think of a horse, is a mixture of all the horses I can imagine in different times, different places, different nature, meaning like red horses, brown horses, black horses. I just think of a general horse. It's sort of a mix of all of these. That's a mental image. But what is that mental image? Is it accessing a real thing, or is it simply accessing a mental projection? And according to Dharmakirti's system, this is simply a mental projection. It's simply a conceptual construct. Whereas in this system of the Vaiseshika, actually what I'm accessing is the ideal horse. There's some kind of real inherent ideal horse that's behind all of the worldly manifestations of horses. And this manifests in them. But there, behind that, there's something more perfect, the real horse. And these are all just mere reflections of that. Now, this might seem very strange. It just seems like, why would anyone want to think that? But it's important to understand that the question here is, for example, when we have an embryo of a horse, why does it develop into a horse? And why doesn't it develop into a cow? the idea here, their belief is that there's something there. There's some kind of prototype, we might say. It's a very good term for it in modern parlance. There's some kind of prototype behind that leads it to evolve, the embryo to evolve into a horse and not into a cow. If there wasn't such a prototype, then it would be random what it changed into. Likewise, the seed of a barley seed will turn into a barley plant. It won't turn into a wheat plant. So there's some kind of prototype inherent in that. And this is very similar to the view of Plato, that behind the material world of constantly changing things, there's an ideal world where there's the idea behind something. So when we have a horse, what appears to our eye consciousness is this reflection of this ideal horse, but behind that there's something else there. The actual horse is how it's called. And in this system, which is based on the Vedas, it's understood that this has to do with sound, because in this system, the Vedic system, sound is considered very sacred. The words of the Vedas are considered unspoken sound. They just exist inherently in things. So the word for horse in Sanskrit, ashva, this actually is not something that somebody made up this word. They believe the Sanskrit language is sacred and inheres in things. So it's not just that the ideal horse, but the sound generality of horse, the ashva, it exists within the horse. It somehow is there within all horses. It's like a vibration, very subtle vibration, such that people then discovered this language, but nobody made it up. So Dharmakirti rejects this with various reasonings. One of the most interesting ones, I think, is that he thinks that this would then lead to infinite multiplication of entities that exist in all horses. Well, do we have also the ideal black horse that exists in all black horses? And then do we have the ideal 15-year-old black horses that all exist in all 15-year-old black horses? And then do we have the ideal 15-year-old black horses, female black horses? And 15-year-old female black horses. So the more specific we get, everything here inherent in nature, and then it becomes an infinite multiplication of these entities, because everything we imagine has to have some kind of inherence in things. But the point here that's being made is that this is a very strong view of an inherent existence. It's reifying that there's some real inherent thing. When I think of a horse, it's not just a concept. There's a real thing that exists above and beyond all the particular horses. There's a generality that's not even dependent on any particular horse. So Nagarjuna is saying that if somebody has such a view, then if they believe that things are inherently existent, there's nothing astonishing about that, because it's actually internally consistent. It's internally consistent to say, well, yeah, because things are independent of each other, then they exist inherently. This ideal horse is not dependent on any particular cause and effect in the world. It's not dependent on parts because it's a partless entity. And it's not dependent on my thinking about it. It's not dependent on any concept. It simply exists before I thought about it. My concept actually discovers what existed before. It doesn't make something new up. So next slide, we have 78, verse 41. Totally unreasonable that our sect's profound inherence. Based upon the Buddha's path, some say it's all impermanent. When questioned, they hold things supreme. Their staying there is wondrous. So this verse is contrasted to the last verse. It's saying that it is nothing astonishing when these Vedic scholars, whose root tenet is that all things exist independently, say that things exist inherently. But then we have Buddhist scholars who agree with the Buddha. Everything is impermanent. Everything is contingent. It's dependent on something else. But in debate, they say things are supreme, meaning they exist inherently. They're truly existent. What a wondrous thing. What a strange thing to say, because it's internally inconsistent. And one of the examples that's given here is the scholar Vasumitra, we see here, who was an early Buddhist scholar before Nagarjuna. one of the great authors of the Vaibhashika system. And so, as actually you'll see, his features look a little Chinese, the reason being that this is a picture from China. In Tibet, he was not revered as a lineage master. He was somebody that was negated. But actually in China, for whatever reason, he is also considered as one of the lineage masters of the Chan system. So they seem to consider him to have been an enlightened being. I'm not sure how that works, because in China also they revere Nagarjuna's system, and Nagarjuna seems to negate him quite strongly. He's one of the main opponents. But in any case, in China they have a different view of who he was, or what his view was, perhaps. In any case, Vasumitra, I think, probably lived, around the 1st century BCE. So one of the very early Buddhist scholars and writers. And he had this very strong view, that thing of creating a world system where things have an inherent nature, and all things exist in a way that even past, present, and future can be pinpointed. The past exists in an inherent way that we can talk about. We can find it, when we under analysis, we can locate these things. So Nagarjuna is saying that this is completely internally contradictory, inconsistent. When you then say everything is impermanent, it's contingent on other things, yet it exists from its own side and inherently. And really, it's not only these Vaibhashika scholars like Vasumitra, but he's also talking about Sautantrika scholars like Dharmakirti, and even mind-only school scholars, and even the other Madhyamaka scholars like Bhavaviveka. Nagarjuna is not talking about him because Bhavaviveka came later, but according to Chandrakirti's commentary and understanding of this, this same internal contradiction would apply to the autonomous school of Middle Way, Bhavaviveka, saying that things exist inherently, even though they don't truly exist. And actually, somebody asked me if I could explain about the three, the three absurdities in the Madhyamaka Vatara. So that relates directly to this, and I won't talk about it right now, but I think we'll have quite a bit of time at the end of this talk, because I don't think we'll go till the end of 4:30. So I will address that question, hopefully, and I will elucidate a little bit about the distinction between Chandrakirti's understanding of Nagarjuna versus Bhavaviveka's, which is very much clarified in those 3 verses from Chandrakirti's text. But suffice to say for now, just that this is pointing out that this is wondrous. Wondrous doesn't mean it's a good thing. It means that it's amazing. It's astonishing that somebody would think such a thing. In the commentary, Chandrakirti says it's like seeing somebody prostrate to something not worthy of prostration, that they're paying homage to something that actually is useless. Somebody vehemently defending this view of inherence, while at the same time saying everything is contingent on other things. So now we move on to the rationale for that. The reason why it's the case that this is internally contradictory. So verse 42, slide 79. When analyzing this and that, they don't observe the slightest thing. What wise one then would ever state that this and that contention is true? So the point here is that things, conventionally we can talk about things existing in a certain way, but under analysis of their nature, when we try to find something among its bases of designation, we don't observe the slightest thing. It's not contingent on something else. So it's talking here about, we say, what is form? What is feeling? What is discrimination? The different aggregates. We cannot point to these independently of the other ones. They only exist in relation to each other. So if you can't show it, then why would you say this and that contention is true? And again, true means ultimately true. Conventionally, yes, one thing could be true and one thing is false, but when we hold to something as inherently true, then it is negated by this analysis. So here I have the picture of Saraha, one of the great Mahasiddhas who was in India, who was known for not being pinned down to a particular view. He would say very different things and often sound to be heretical when he talked about the Buddhist teachings, because he was not attached to fixed views of things. He was more interested in breaking people out of their fixed views than in establishing more strongly their views, even Buddhist views. So next we have, similar to, this is sort of a explanation of the past three stanzas. We start again with the people who adhere strongly to inherent existence. So the river of views carries them away from liberation's path. Those who say things don't depend adhere to self and world as real. These ones, alas, are seized by views, impermanence and permanence. So again, it's talking here about mainly about non-Buddhist scholars who say that things are not dependent. There's no dependent origination. Things exist independently. Either the Samkhya school saying that there's an inherent nature underlying things, or the Vaisheshika school saying that there's not one particular inherent nature, but everything has its own inherent nature. So this is the main difference, is that in the Vaisheshika school, a horse and a cow have different ultimate natures. The ultimate horse and the ultimate cow. These are these things that underlie them. Whereas in the Samkhya school, there's actually an inherent nature that underlies both of them, so that the horse and the cow are ultimately the same nature. But in either case, they're talking about some kind of inherent nature behind things that's independent of any particular cause, any parts, any concept of it. So such people, alas, are seized by views. They fluctuate between one view and the other, impermanence and permanence. When you think something exists inherently, then it either has to come from nowhere, or it has to have always existed at all times. Because otherwise it could not be inherent. If it only existed contingently, then it couldn't inhere. It would have to depend on things. Because if it comes into existence and then stops existing, there has to be some reason it stopped existing. But if something is inherently existent, it either is impermanent in the sense that it does, in the here it's saying nihilistic, that it just doesn't exist at all. And in this case, for example, the Vaisheshika system, it's being said that they're too nihilistic about conventional truth. They're saying that the horse that appears to my eye consciousness is not the real horse. There's something more real behind that. So it's actually nihilistic view of our ordinary experience, saying this is all just unreal. You know, we do say it's unreal in Buddhism, but it's unreal in a different way. It exists conventionally. It's not completely unreal. Whereas here it's saying that it doesn't exist at all. It's just a mere reflection of this ideal horse, which is real. So then it comes to the other extreme of saying things are permanent. There's something real that always existed and doesn't depend on anything else. It has some kind of behind the material world of contingent things, there's some kind of inherently real thing. I'm actually a little bit reminded as I say that, some of you might know the novel by the author Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. We read this several times when I was in school, so I remember reading. I remember it quite clearly. And this is sort of the thrust of this book, is that behind the world, constantly changing world, and this, what was Virginia Woolf was renowned for was her style of writing, which captured this change simply in the style of language. This world that constantly changes and can't be pinned down. There's some kind of stable thing behind that. So like a lighthouse amidst all the changing waves, there's something stable there. So this is what these views are clinging to, that there's something real that we can cling to behind the changing world. Now, this could sound very similar to emptiness, that behind all the change, there's something unchanging. The difference here is that in this system, emptiness is still contingent phenomenon. It's not like we clear away everything else and there's emptiness. Emptiness only exists in relation to things that are empty. We cannot find or pinpoint emptiness either. So this is a very subtle distinction. And this is exactly what I was just saying, that those who cling to emptiness, then they're incurable, because the very view that's meant to take away the view of permanence, the view of unchanging, then is is used to establish some kind of fixed view. And also, actually, in the commentary here to this verse, Chandrakirti specifically references Kumarila Bhatta, Mimamsa scholar. So I think in the previous one I'd mentioned him also. I think maybe I wrote it down incorrectly here, because there's a distinction between Mimamsa and Vaisheshika. So I'm not sure, actually. I made a mistake. I think Kumarila should be the Vaisheshika scholar. But in any case, in the Mimamsa school, it was another Vedic school which very strongly adhered to these views of permanence. When we talk about the Vedas, and Dharmakirti negates the Vedas as being inherent and existent, the main school he's negating is the Mimamsa, because the Mimamsa school heavily adheres to the Vedas as something inherently existent, that the Vedas are the unspoken texts. So it seems that perhaps Nagarjuna in this verse he was referencing these ones, that the river of views carries them away from liberation's path. And actually, the Mimamsa do, according at least to our presentation of them, which was from the 6th century, they believed that there was no liberation from samsara. The only thing we could hope for was a higher rebirth. And the way to achieve that was to follow the rituals prescribed in the Vedas. But there's no actual freedom from samsara overall. So next, we have slide 81, which is verse 44. Even our own sects are seized by views. Those who say dependent things and suchness are established too, for these as well, how could these faults, like permanence, not still ensue? So again, it's saying that although you might then agree that things are dependent, but then you say that they exist inherently, then these same faults ensue of permanence and impermanence, nihilism and eternalism. It doesn't matter whether you say conventionally, okay, I agree, things are impermanent, everything changes, but they're real. Then really, it's as if you're saying they're permanent, even though you don't specifically say that. You have this sense that they have their root, as we have the picture of the tree here, that it's somehow grounded in something findable. So next, verse 45, slide 82. Those who propound emptiness are the opposite. So this is then talking about the right view. Those who say dependent things are like a moon within a lake, not genuine but not unreal. No more are these ones seized by views. So here we have, you see that you might notice that the first line of this verse is the same as the first line of the last verse. Those who say dependent things, but then rather than saying that they're established, they're like a moon in a lake. They're simply reflection. They don't exist inherently, but they're not genuine, but they're also not unreal. The moon and the lake exist, but it doesn't exist as a moon. It doesn't exist as it appears. It exists in a contingent way. These ones are no longer seized by views, because not genuine means it's not the eternalistic or permanent view, but not unreal means it's not the nihilistic view either. So they stand in the middle between these views. So next, in the commentary, actually, it's Gache who cites this verse from Aryadeva in his 400 stanzas. Aryadeva was the main student of Nagarjuna. This is the next slide, 83. Those who assert effects exist, or who assert they don't exist, for them, what use within a house are pillars and such as ornaments? So he's saying that if you would assert that things exist inherently, or that they don't exist at all, in either case, there's no use for things to perform functions. So if the house existed inherently, if the roof existed inherently as a roof, then it wouldn't require a pillar to support it, because it's a roof in and of itself. It's its nature to be a roof. It wouldn't fall down to the ground because a roof is something that's on top of a house. So there's no use for a pillar if it's an inherently existent roof. But if things don't exist at all, And there's also no use for a pillar, because what roof is there for the pillar to support? There's no roof whatsoever. Why would you want to build a house in the first place? So next we have view, slide 84, verse 46, which is then showing the faults. So as I mentioned, this section is about what's the faults of adhering to these things. So the first part we just had was sort of the introductory, setting the context for that. And now it's showing specifically what's the fault of having this view. If you accept that things are real, unbearably ferocious views, the cause of hatred and desire will come from these disputes ensue. So the problem with this view is that then we get very attached to our views. We think this is right and this is wrong, and this is real and this is good and this is bad. And then we get attached to what we like and what we don't like, and we start arguing with other people. So disputes ensue, and also all of our cycling and samsara ensues. Again, it's not to say that we should not have an opinion about anything, but we have to be very careful that our opinion is not adhering to something as inherently existent, because then our opinion, it's very hard to change that depending on new evidence, new ways of seeing things. We're recognizing that our opinion of something is only in relation to something else. And so we might recognize, for example, this person is a criminal. And yes, it's true, we should put this person in jail because this person has done bad actions. And if we don't put them in jail, they might continue doing that. But then if we thereby think this person is inherently evil, then no matter how kind this person ends up being and asks for forgiveness, we won't forgive them because we've already made up our minds that this person is bad. We can't see it from a different perspective that, oh, actually this person, although they did commit these crimes, they've also done a lot of good things to other people and might be a very compassionate person. We have a very fixed view and a one-sided view of things. So then it's the cause of hatred and desire. Likewise, we see something as only good. We're very attracted to a particular person and think, if only I could have this person, then I'd be happy. If I could seduce this person, or if I could marry this person, I'd be happy forever, because they're perfect in all ways. And without really paying attention to all the flaws about this person, such that after 5 years of marriage, we can't stand living with them anymore, because we didn't really recognize from the first place all of the ways that our view was exaggerated. So next we have slide that. So if this is wrong, how do we reverse these views? This is the cause of all the views. With that, so in knowing this exhaustively, so all of the afflictions of hatred, attachment, jealousy, pride, conceit, they all come from this view of things as inherently existent. If we don't have that, we don't already conceive of an object, then we can't exaggerate that object as being excessively good or excessively bad. Thing that exists independence and other things. Otherwise, as I said earlier on the first day about cutting the branches of a tree, some antidotes to afflictions like meditation on love and compassion can cut the branches, but they don't cut out the root. But this uproots all the afflictions from the root. So it's saying here that in the commentary that this is showing that we say the forward pervasion. That is, forward pervasion simply means that something is necessarily so. So if somebody has the belief in inherent existence, then it pervades, or it's certain that they will develop hatred and attachment, because they will hate the people who disagree with their view and be attached to the people who agree with their view, or at least be attached to their view. Whereas we say the reverse pervasion, or the opposite of that, is therefore, if somebody realizes emptiness and does not believe in inherent existence, then they will have the opposite. They will not have attachment. They will not have anger, because they don't have any cause for those things. So next, slide 86, verse 48. Dependent arising and lack of inherence are not contradictory. Who understands this, you might ask? It's those who see dependent birth. What's born dependent is unborn. Supreme One knowing thusness said. So the understanding that uproots this view of inherence is to see things as dependent. So it says here, the first line is the question. Who understands this? Who it is that understands the lack of inherent existence? And the second line is the answer to that, those who see dependent birth. The third line shows the nature of that. What they see is that what's born dependent is unborn. In the sense, it is not born inherently. Because it's born dependent in other things, we can't pinpoint its birth as an independent thing. And then the fourth line shows who said that, the Supreme One knowing thusness. The Buddha said that. So then somebody might debate, well then how is it not contradictory to say that what's born is not born? But then the answer to this is that born in the sense of unborn is talking about inherent birth. It's not born inherently. But in terms of on a conventional or an obscure level of ordinary beings, then it appears to be born. So this then makes reference in the commentary to the sutra requested by Anavatapta. This is a sutra spoken by the Buddha. So Anavatapta is an ancient name for the lake that's now known as, I think, what is Manasarovar in Tibet near Mount Kailash. This in Tibetan, the word matropa, which means not heated or never warms up. So the cold lake. And so supposedly there's the Naga king, Anavatapta, who lives in this lake, and he requested the Buddha to teach. And so the Buddha taught this sutra saying, whatever is born from causes is unborn. Doesn't have the nature to be born. What rests on causes we call emptiness. Who knows this emptiness is vigilant. So specifically, again, what's born from causes is not inherently born. It doesn't have the nature to be born. I mean, it's not inherently born. But what rests on causes, that's exactly what we call emptiness. Emptiness and dependent arising have the same meaning. And those who know this emptiness are vigilant, which is an important point. It's not that those who know this emptiness don't care about anything or just space out. They actually are very careful about cause and effect because they recognize that every cause is going to have an effect. It's quite the opposite of the idea that simply by realizing emptiness, you're free from karma. It's quite the opposite, that you see that actually every cause will have a specific effect because the cause does not exist inherently. It's always changing into something else. And thereby, what we consider stable now will change. So we have to be very careful. Our current state of mind, our current state of existence is frail, is fragile, and will change. So we have to be very careful. So next we have verse 49, stanza 88. Slide 88. This is quite similar to the earlier slide, the earlier verse. It says, arising and emptiness, as contradictory, is the source of all faults. Oppressed by faulty consciousness, these untrue things they hold as true. Then utter clinging and disputes in stages from attachment come. So basically, if we think that things that arise from causes are real, inherently real, then we'll have attachment to our view. And we'll argue with people who have what we perceive as the other view. And from that, all the attachment and anger and all the afflictions come about. So then we have the opposite of that in the next slide. Slide 89, verse 51. So I think I missed verse 50. I'm not sure what happened here, but in any case, we'll start with this. How the great ones realize this. So this is how those who realize the opposite to that wrong view. So the great ones have in all respects no standpoint and thus no disputes. For those who have no standpoints, how could others' standpoints stand for them? So this is what I was mentioning earlier. I will get to this point. It's saying that you have no standpoint. You have no view. You see someone here floating in space. There's no reference point. So the great ones, being the Arya beings, in all respects, in all ways, they have no standpoint. And so they can't dispute with anybody because they don't hold any position. How can I say that I disagree with you when I don't have any particular opinion myself? For those who have no standpoints, how could other standpoints stand for them? So how could I have the view that you are wrong and you're contradictory to me when I don't have any view myself? So again, some people interpret this as saying that therefore they have no view at all. That Nagarjuna's philosophy is only about negating others' views, but not about establishing his own view. But at least in the Gaelic interpretation, the point here is that there's no inherent view. We don't inherently believe that things are either one way or the other. They're not born from self or born from other. They're not eternal. They're not non-existent. They stand in the middle between that, free from all fabrication. We see things as dependent and contingent. We don't see anything as existing in and of itself. So in that sense, there's no view because there's nothing that exists in contradicting to something else. Every situation is approached understanding the contingency of things, so we don't have any fixed viewpoint. We can see things as they are. It doesn't mean that we don't see anything at all, but we're not attached to a particular way of seeing things. We are able to judge each thing. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't thereby accumulate experience and have, know from our experience that certain things are good, are useful practices, certain things are not so useful. But we don't get so attached to that we thereby can't see things, can't take in new information. We're able to be spacious, as we see in this man in space, have room to change our view based on new evidence because we're not so attached to it being one way or the other. So then somebody asks, well, why do you compose any text at all if you have no view? But again, the answer is that there's no inherently established position. There's still a sense of, yes, there is, conventionally speaking, a right answer and a wrong answer to certain questions. And we have to be able to recognize when people have wrong views and point that out to them. So I remember one time the great Vietnamese master Thich Nhat Hanh, he said that the right view is no view. So again, I think we have to be careful what this means. Really what this means is we don't hold a fixed opinion about things. We don't hold the idea that this is right and this is wrong all the time in all places. But at the same time, clearly Thich Nhat Hanh himself has many views. He presents them. He believes that mindfulness is a useful practice and that anger is destructive. This is a view. This is, it's not an inherent view. If you think mindfulness is a useful practice, so much so that when somebody has cancer, you tell them, don't get any treatment, just practice mindfulness and it'll get better. That becomes an extreme view. But conventionally speaking, we can talk about certain things based on our experience, or through our life experience, our study, our reflection on things. It's not that we just don't think about anything and don't study anything and just abide in a state of complete, sometimes there's the view that in meditation we don't want to think at all. We just want to be completely blank and just allow every situation to unfold. But this is too extreme. This also becomes an extreme view that, okay, we don't need to think at all because there's no truth, there's no view. This then becomes, again, adhering to emptiness as a view. So then actually in Tibet, there was a lot of confusion about this as well. So Nagarjuna is saying, I have no thesis at all. I'll mention this in a minute, but first I want to say, how did people interpret this? I have no thesis. And then, so different scholars before Tsongkhapa, one of them was Patsap Lotsawa, and actually he's the translator of this text we're reading right now. This text was composed in Sanskrit and then was translated into Tibetan by Patsap Lotsawa. So Patsap had the view that when Nagarjuna said, I have no thesis, He means that there's a negation with nothing established. So for example, when we negate inherent existence, it does not establish the lack of inherent existence. It simply establishes nothing, there's nothing established. But according to Tsongkhapa, this is too extreme. Then it's thereby negating emptiness. It's saying there's nothing to realize at all. He says, and he specifically quotes Nagarjuna saying that if things, if the lack of inherent existence were reversed, then things would be inherently existent, which is, I think, a very apt point. This is from Nagarjuna's Dispeller of Disputes. In this text, he says that these are two opposites. So it's either one or the other. Things are either inherently existent or they're not inherently existent. They can't be both not inherently existent nor not inherently existent. It's like saying, somebody is either tall or short. You can't say he's neither tall or short on a conventional level. Saying somebody is not tall but is a person, it implies that they're short. It doesn't not imply anything at all. So saying that there's no inherent existence implies that there's lack of inherent existence. There's some standpoint. So Tsongkhapa is negating this view of Patsap. And similarly, we have another scholar, R. Jungchup Yeshe, who was a scholar before Tsongkhapa, who had a very similar view to Patsap. There were others who say that when we talk about things as existing, they only exist from the perspective of a mistaken consciousness. But from the perspective of a wisdom consciousness, nothing exists at all. And again, Tsongkhapa says that this is too extreme because it's a confounding not finding existence versus negating existence. When somebody analyzes with wisdom, what is the nature of a person, they can't locate the person on the basis of designation. They do not find anything. But that not finding does not negate the person existing. It simply does not find them ultimately. Conventionally, the person still exists. But this view of some previous Tibetans would then thereby negate that there is any conventional establishment at all. So then another way to understand it is that Nagarjuna only argues with consequences, but has no thesis of his own. He doesn't say this is true because that is true. But Tsongkhapa also negates this. Nagarjuna often gives theses and proofs of these theses. He does this in this very text. Just earlier I said Nagarjuna says that those who adhere to inherence, that is the cause of all anger. So then the opposite is true. Those who do not adhere to inherence have no anger because they have no cause of anger. This is a thesis, and this is a proof of that. So he is often using theses and proofs. It's not that he's only using consequences to negate others' views. So next, we have this quote here from Dispeller of Disputes, Nagarjuna's other text, which is one that they're talking about with this argument. If I had any thesis at all, then I'd have this view you state. Since I have no thesis at all, I'm absolutely without fault. So you see that the person is trying to shoot an arrow to hit the target of his view, but they can't hit it because there's nothing to hit. There's no target. But again, this is interpreted to mean there's no inherent thesis. It's not saying that Nagarjuna does not have a view. And one way that Tsongkhapa rejects this, people citing this verse, is to say that if this verse was really saying Nagarjuna has no view at all, then since all followers of Nagarjuna accept this text, Dispeller Disputes, they should all agree on that. But actually, all Tibetans agree that Bhavaviveka, in his understanding, does talk about syllogisms and reasonings and having a view, an opinion. So why would Bhavaviveka have that view if Nagarjuna was meaning that he has no view at all? So the point here is not that he has no view, that he has no, inherent thesis, meaning that, I'll come to that in a second, that he has, the person who's asking this question thinks that things either have to exist inherently or not exist at all. They don't understand that something could exist but still not exist inherently. So when they argue with him, because in this Dispeller of Disputes, the main argument of the text is somebody saying to Nagarjuna, look, you said nothing exists inherently. But if nothing exists inherently, then you have no argument. So there's nobody who's saying that things don't exist inherently, and there's nobody negating anything, and there's no argument. So how could you even negate anything at all? But then they're conflating the argument not being inherently existent with the argument not functioning conventionally. So they can't understand it's some middle way between that. So if Nagarjuna had any thesis of saying that there is no argument at all, or there's an inherent argument, he'd have that fault that this person states, but he's between those two. He has neither of those theses. No thesis means he has neither of the theses that the person believes to exist. It's subtler than that. So you've asked, there is no inherent thesis, is the view itself? Yes, so it is a view. And Nagarjuna has a view, he has an opinion, but he does not have an inherent opinion. His opinion is contingent upon particular things. What's right in the right answer is only right in relation to a particular question. Nothing can be right at all times in all places. So next we have verse 51. So this is, I said I made a mistake. The last verse was verse 50. I just labeled it 51. So now we have verse 51, slide 91. Why this is the case, meaning why this is the cause of this wrong view of inherence, is the cause of all these problems. So detecting an abode, this snake, affliction, slithering, poisonous, takes hold of them, but those whose minds have no abodes, it cannot seize. So an abode here is talking about a belief in inherent existence, having some kind of sense of a reference point, that this is who I am, or this is what this thing really is. As soon as you have that, then the snake of afflictions will grab hold of you, because then you start to have views of good and bad and right and wrong in an inherent sense. So this snake takes hold of them, but those whose minds have no abodes, they do not hold anything to be inherently established, then they can avoid this snake. The snake has nowhere to abide within their minds. So abode also has the meaning of cause. It doesn't have this in English. The word in Tibetan, ne, which means a place to abide, it can also mean jung ne, which means the source of something. So it's a double entendre in Tibetan, that it's both in a place for the snake to abide, and it's a source of these afflictions. It's a source of suffering. Also, this word slithering, the word yochen in Tibetan, I've translated as slithering. Yochen just means something that's moving. It's so slithering. It's like it's not stable. It's always moving. But Tsongkhapa actually, in his notes on this text, he glosses it as yunchen, which means like a demon. So it's the demon of afflictions. Either way, it's simply a metaphor for how the afflictions exist. So next we have section 5, slide 92. With adherence to true existence, you cannot abandon afflictions. So I mentioned, if any of you recall, I think it was verse 4, which was saying that those with the view of existence cannot be free, and those with the view of non-existence also cannot be free from some cyclic existence, but those who know thoroughly existence and non-existence thereby find release from cyclic existence. So I mentioned that was the most important verse in the text, the most often quoted. So that, as well as this next verse that we're going to come to, are really the ones that seem to embody the text as itself, and Tsongkhapa quotes them very frequently, because it's showing that with adherence to true existence, as long as you have the view of things as inherently existent, you cannot abandon afflictions. So it's showing very clearly that in the Hinayana Sutras, the Buddha must have taught emptiness, because if he didn't, nobody could have achieved arhatship. Simply by meditating on impermanence, meditating on the Four Noble Truths, or meditating even on the absence of a substantial person, you cannot be free of afflictions, because as long as you have the view of inherent existence, it will be the cause for afflictions to come back again. So we have the next slide, verse 52. Afflictions are always there in the background. In those whose minds an abode still dwells, how could affliction's venom not lurk? For even when they rest in calm, affliction's snake has hold of them. So you see this man, he seems quite calm, yet he's being strangled by a snake. So the understanding here is that even when we rest in calm, meaning that even when we're in a fairly neutral state of mind, there's not strong attachment, not strong anger, the snake of affliction still has hold in our minds, as long as we conceive things as inherently existent, and abode still dwells in the mind, meaning that we still have a sense of things existing in a particular inherent way. So the potential for afflictions to arise is still there. So people might meditate, and achieve some kind of meditative calm, and think I'm free because I used to have all these up and down emotions, but nowadays I'm very calm. Shanti, shanti, we might say in India. That people, achieve some degree of stability in meditation, and they feel that, that thereby, I've achieved something. I've achieved some realization. I mentioned this also in the Buddha's time, that the Buddha even had some teachers who believed that they had achieved liberation, and the Buddha practiced what they taught and decided that that's not liberation, that they've not really destroyed the seed of affliction, even though it's not manifest in their minds. They're still in the hold of the snake. So Chandrakirti has a very similar idea that he presents in this verse from Supplement to the Middle Way. This is the next slide, 94. Without understanding the truth, attachment will always come back. Your yogic mind, perceiving selflessness, fails to see the truth of forms and such. Observing and engaging forms, desire comes again. You haven't seen their core. So you see here this man meditating in what seems like a very peaceful setting at the beach. So it seems, he's achieved some kind of peace of mind. And maybe he thinks that he's seen selflessness. Your yogic mind perceiving selflessness fails to see the truth. Really, you have only seen a coarse form of selflessness. You failed to see the truth, meaning the lack of inherent existence. So you still think that things are real. You think that I am this real person who's achieved the real enlightenment, and I'm now free. So you observe things and engage in forms. You engage in that, you thereby act in accordance with what appears to you. And then desire will come again, because you think this is real. So then you start attaching to certain forms, because you haven't seen their core, you haven't seen their essence, what they really are. So at a certain point, your meditation will decline, your stability of mind will decline, and you'll start having anger and attachment again, even if you don't have it right now. And actually, when it says your yogic mind perceiving selflessness, although I've used it in this context to say, oh, this man, your yogic mind, your mind, it's not actually what Chandrakirti meant in his stanza. He wasn't talking about you meditator. He was talking to Baba Viveka and saying your concept of what a yogic mind is, what you consider to be the yogic mind perceiving selflessness, is not the yogic mind perceiving selflessness, because you don't understand emptiness. So your conceptual idea of what makes a yogi is wrong. Your idea of a yogi is not a real yogi. It's not somebody who's really seen the truth. So next, verse 53, slide 95. So you should have compassion for those with such a view. Young children, thinking they are real, attached to mere reflected forms. Just like that, the world's confused, caught within the object's snare. So it's simply given an example. These people who think things are real are like babies who see a reflection and think that it's another baby. And it says in the commentary, he says, then they try to bite the mirror because they think it's another baby. But just in the same way, worldly beings see things and think that they're real. They're merely a reflection of imprints in their own minds. But they're caught within the object's snare. They adhere to all of this as real, and then have an entire concept of who I am and my life story and my worldview. and then live in that way and create suffering for themselves. So that's why we should have compassion, both for these people and for ourselves who are also caught in this object snare. So next we have verse 54, how others are reversed from that. Others being the Arya beings who have reversed from that. The great ones with their wisdom eye observe all things within this world as like reflections. They are not caught in so-called objects' mire. So those who see things as not inherently existent are no longer caught, and they're able to be free from samsara, from the constant cycling between emotions of attachment and anger. So next we have verse 55. Those who are and aren't attached to objects. So it's just presenting the divisions now. Different levels of stages of realization that somebody might have. The childish attached to forms. The next best are attachment free. The wise ones are the wise with supreme intellect, know form's true nature and are free. So the first stage we have the childish, meaning ordinary beings, who are attached to forms. They like pretty forms, they don't like ugly forms, and they create samsara for themselves. But the next level are attachment free, meaning that beings who achieve what some of you might know are dhyanic concentration and formless absorptions, where they let go of attachment for the world, but they haven't seen its nature. We say it's only that they stop engaging in it. So it's simply concentrating on something else. So this is like if somebody, is in a lot of pain and they take a medication to numb the pain. Somebody who does this kind of meditation, they don't really have any insight into the cause of problems. They simply stop focusing on them. They simply withdraw from the world and focus on something else. And this is what's understood, that people who engage in these concentrations, they focus on how wonderful the form realm is, or the formless realm is. And they focus on how undesirable things in this desire realm that we experience are. So they see the things that we see as beautiful as being ugly. One second. Okay, sorry about that. So the point here is that, so some of you might know about these different kinds of meditations. And so when we understand form, a beautiful form, what's something that appears to us projected as beautiful, inherently it's neither beautiful nor ugly. So either is an extreme. If we had extremely considered this entire world as undesirable and miserable and want to leave this world, that's also an extreme view. And this kind of meditation is a way of using concentration to achieve that and go to a better world where things are more beautiful and less coarse. But it's attachment free, but not attachment. It's not cutting attachment at the root. It's only free of the coarse level of attachment. So it doesn't really get at the root of the problem. But next we have the wiser with supreme intellect, know form's true nature and are free. Meaning that rather than seeing things as either good or bad, beautiful or ugly, they understand contingent. Nothing is inherently beautiful, nothing is inherently ugly. It's simply dependent, and understanding all the subtle levels of dependence that cause things to arise. So somebody who has this view should actually have a very precise understanding of why things occur in the world. And it's like an adult who looks at children. A child's game, the adult, the children all have particular views of things that are very naive. The adult doesn't reject them. He just simply sees things as they are without all these projections in a much more mature way. So we can say that this wise one, perhaps mature is the word here. They've outgrown the childish games of the world, but they don't feel the need to leave the world because They no longer see it as either good or bad. It's simply how it is, see it as it is. So next we have verse 56, slide 98. This is very similar, stating that same point more clearly. How lovely from this one's attached. Reversing that, desire fades. When beings illusion-like are seen as barren, sorrows passed beyond. So the first one, again, is childish beings who think this is so wonderful, this is so lovely, and they get attached to this world. And those who reverse that, who see this world as just filth, and I don't want to be part of this disgusting desire realm anymore, then desire for that fades. But when beings are seen as just illusions, then what's the point of being either attached to them or averse to them? It's just an illusion, seen as barren. Then sorrows pass beyond, meaning someone achieves nirvana. So barren, of course, just means empty, is another way of stating empty of inherent existence. So next we have the last part, section 6, great qualities of liberation. Okay, I have your question here. So I'll save this because we have a few questions to address at the end. So I'll see how much time we have and I'll try to go through the questions, but we'll keep this on the board here. And then when at the end, I'll come to the questions. So we have section 6, great qualities of liberation. So saying how wonderful it is to be free of this. So it's simply just stating the wonderful qualities of being free from this view of inherent existence. So slide 100, verse 57. Affliction's fault is misery, from understanding erringly. It won't arise when knowing the truth of concepts of non-being and being. So the major fault of afflictions is misery. It causes suffering. That's a pretty big fault. It's the cause of all suffering in the world. So, and it comes from understanding erringly, from misunderstanding the way things exist. But it won't arise when someone knows the truth, when they know the truth of dependent arising. The concepts of non-being and being. They know behind these things that both of these concepts are extreme views. They over-exaggerate the qualities of things. It's like if you have a dream about somebody, you know, we can argue and argue and argue about who they are, but it's just a dream. So this is the great qualities of abandonment. This is one aspect of liberation, that you've abandoned the afflictions. The other side of that is the great qualities of realization. You've not only abandoned something, you've gained something. So verse 58. If with abodes attachment and lack of attachment come to be, with no abode the great souled beings have no attachment or its lack. So again, abodes, as we said, means conceiving some kind of inherent existence, and thereby you either have attachment and are in their desire realm, or disenchantment with that and go to the higher realms of the form and formless realm. But with no abode, with no sense of things as existing in an inherent way, then the great souled beings, and you see here the Buddha with his followers of arhats, this whole great assembly, have no attachment or its lack. So again, they don't have attachment. So lack here does not mean that they're not free of attachment, but they don't have the lack, meaning this kind of lack of attachment that leads to birth in the formless realm, where it's actually seeing things as gross or undesirable. It's seeing things simply as not inherently existing at all in either way. So finally, we have verse 59, concluding summary. Slide 102. The ones who think this all is void don't waver though mind fluctuates. They cross the ocean of this world so harshly stirred by Klesha's snake. So here, the ones who think this all is void means those who realize emptiness. And it says they don't waver though mind fluctuates. This is meant to be talking about bodhisattvas or even hearers, but those who are on the paths of accumulation and the path of preparation, meaning that they have not directly realized emptiness. So even though their mind still fluctuates, they still have afflictions in their mind, it does not affect them. It does not cause them to waver from their single pointed devotion to the path, because they recognize that that freedom is possible, and that they understand conceptually, at least, that their afflictions are grounded in wrong views. And then from that, they cross the ocean of this world, meaning that they have a direct perception of emptiness. They're free from this world, so harshly stirred by klesha's snake. So many of you will know klesha is the Sanskrit for affliction. The snake of afflictions stirs the ocean of this world. But when you have a strong boat being the three higher trainings of ethical discipline, concentration, and wisdom, ultimately wisdom into emptiness, then you can cross the ocean of this world and the waves won't affect you. So finally, verse 60, dedicating the merit of composing. May all beings by this virtue collect the merit and the wisdom stores, and win the dual excellence that merit wisdom will produce. So here Nagarjuna is dedicating the merit of having composed this text. So by this virtue, may beings collect the two collections. We have the merit collection and the wisdom collection. So again, as I mentioned many times, this isn't just about gaining wisdom. We also have to accumulate a lot of merit on the spiritual path. And when the dual excellence means the two bodies of the Buddha, that the wisdom collection brings the Dharmakaya, the wisdom mind of the Buddha. The merit collection is the cause of the form body of the Buddha, such that the Buddha can manifest in real time to help beings and not just be an abstract mind that doesn't manifest in the world. It's the dual excellence that merit wisdom will produce. And also then there's of course, because this Gyaltsabje is a Geluk scholar, he goes into quite a digression here about what is the form body of the Buddha, because some other schools have the idea that the form body of the Buddha is not really a Buddha, it's merely an appearance from the side of sentient beings, but that from the Buddha's own side, there's no appearance of conventional reality. But that's, in the Gaelic view, that's not true, that the Buddha still has appearance of convention, but there's no longer grasping to them as inherently established. That's quite a different topic. But now we'll just move on. Last slide here. So you might be surprised, I've put a quote here from the Bible, but I think it's very apt in this particular context. Some of you might know this. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So here we have Nagarjuna stating that the only way to be free is to realize emptiness. This is a very narrow path. There are very few who find it. Chandrakirti himself mentioned some of these great Buddhist scholars of India, the towering intellectual figures, Vasubandhu and Dignaga, still did not find this very narrow gate. And there's we say, the road that leads to destruction, or sometimes this is translated as perdition. Many enter through it. Many think that they're on the right path, but they go to the wrong path. And of course, even more people aren't on any path at all. They're simply blindly following their desires and their craving. But there's a very narrow gate. There's a way out, but it's very hard to locate. The fortunate thing in Buddhism is that we have a lot of chances to locate it. If you don't find it this time, you'll eventually find it. But you won't eventually find it unless you expect that, well, I'll get there eventually, so no need to worry. And you can't just pray to get there. You have to start now. And eventually, if we continue to collect merit and continue to reason with things and consider things, then eventually we might find it at some point. So I've inserted here some dedication verses that Nagarjuna himself composed from precious Garland. It's nice to read these. Nagarjuna himself suggests reading these 20 verses every day. So we can read these together, and then I will start with some of the question and answer. And then again, we can do the other dedication verses at the end. But since, just to finish through the slides, let's read these together, the dedication verses, so just slide down as we go through them. Going for refuge with all forms of respect to the Buddha's excellent doctrine, supreme community and bodhisattvas, I bow down to all that are worthy of honor. I will turn away from all ill deeds and thoroughly take up all meritorious actions. I will admire all the merits of all embodied beings. With bowed heads and joined palms, I petition the perfect Buddhas to turn the wheel of doctrine and remain as long as transmigrating beings remain. Through the merit of having done thus, and through the merit that I did earlier and will do, may all sentient beings aspire to the highest enlightenment. May all sentient beings have all the stainless faculties, release from all conditions of non-leisure, freedom of action, and endowment with good livelihood. Also, may all embodied beings have jewels in their hands, and may all the limitless necessities of life remain unconsumed as long as there is cyclic existence. May all women at all times become supreme persons. May all embodied beings have the intelligence of wisdom and the legs of ethics. May embodied beings have a pleasant complexion, good physique, great splendor, a pleasing appearance, freedom from desire, strength, and long life. May all be skilled in the means to extinguish suffering and have liberation from all suffering, inclination to the three jewels, and the great wealth of the Buddhist doctrine. May they be adorned with love, compassion, joy, even-mindedness, devoid of the afflictive emotions, giving, ethics, patience, effort, concentration, and wisdom, merit and wisdom. May they have the brilliant marks and beautiful features, even while on the path. And may they cross without interruption the inconceivable tendency, inconceivable grounds. May I also be adorned completely with all those and all other good qualities, be freed from all defects, and have superior love for all sentient beings. May I perfect all the virtues for which all sentient beings hope, and may I always relieve the suffering of all embodied beings. May those beings in all worlds who are distressed through fear become entirely fearless, even through merely hearing my name. Through seeing or thinking of me, or only hearing my name, may beings attain great joy, naturalness free from error, definiteness towards complete enlightenment, and the 5 clairvoyances all throughout their continuum of lives. May I always in all ways bring help and happiness to all sentient beings. May I always without harm simultaneously stop all beings in all worlds who wish to commit evil deeds. May I always be an object of enjoyment for all sentient beings according to their wish and without interference, as are the earth, water, fire, wind, herbs, and wild forests. May I be as dear to sentient beings as their own life, and may they be even more dear to me. May their ill deeds fructify for me, and may all my virtues fructify for them. As long as any sentient being anywhere has not been liberated, may I remain in the world for the sake of that being, though I have attained highest enlightenment. Okay, and the last slide, we have the Dharma wheel. Thank you. But we have about half an hour left, and I don't mind if we go over time if anyone wants to stay. So now I will answer some of the questions that have been left over from last session and this session. And then after that, if other people have questions, we can continue. So let's see. So I had a couple of questions that came in the last session. The first one was, what is the origin of mind? And I said that's something that's quite a complex topic. But basically, the answer is there is no origin of mind. This one point Nagarjuna was making continuously is that there is no end and no beginning. An end and a beginning only exist in relation to something else. So the beginning of one thing can only be the end of something else. So in Buddhism, we talk about everything being impermanent, but impermanent and eternal are not contradictory. Impermanent means that something changes moment to moment, but that negates permanence. But eternal means something exists at all times, even though it changes all the time. So both the physical world and the non-physical mind are things that are eternal. They just continue. The continuity of these continues, but it's always changing. So it's not fixed in a particular way. Eternal, the is different than impermanent. So some things are temporary. For example, India is temporary. India is both impermanent and temporary. India is always changing, but India is always temporary. There will come a time when India no longer exists. It had a continuity and then it ceased to exist. But something can also be impermanent and eternal, like the mind or like the physical world. Something can also be temporary but permanent. And an example of that that's given, it would be like the empty space inside a cup. So the empty space inside a cup is simply a lack. It's equally a negation of something. So it doesn't change moment to moment. But it's temporary because when you smash the cup, then there's no longer any concept of the space inside the cup. It only exists for a certain period of time, but during the time it exists, it doesn't change moment to moment. Whereas the mind is something that's always changing, but it doesn't have a beginning or an end. And actually, at a deeper level, we have to understand that beginning and end are simply things that exist in a relation to a particular experience. So to imagine there's some time before the mind existed, this is actually ascribing a kind of inherent existence to the mind. It's like the mind is something, there's some kind of object of experience that is the mind, whereas the mind is a thing within which the space within which these experiences are occurring. This has to do with, again, our experience of samsara. We don't realize that all of this is occurring within the space of consciousness. So to ask, when did the mind exist? When did it begin? Imagines that the mind, that there's some kind of inherent thing within findable thing that is the mind. I think this actually becomes a big problem nowadays with the mind-body dispute. This question of what is the mind, and a lot of people in philosophy now and in science will say there's no such thing as mind because we can't find it, we can't locate it. Therefore, it must not be anything at all. There's just the brain. This is an interesting point. In some sense, they've given their own absurd consequence. If we accept that mind can only be a functioning thing within the spatial realm, then it doesn't exist. So therefore, mind doesn't exist. But this is absurd because we all experience it. So it's just like saying, well, I know that the body doesn't exist because logically it doesn't exist. So although I see it, it must be wrong. This seems like maybe there's a problem here. So maybe it exists in a different way than our normal concepts of how something exists. Maybe its interaction with the material world is very different than the way one billiard ball interacts with another billiard ball. Yet still, it can have some kind of causal efficacy. So that's a very brief answer to your question. Another question I received was about the three absurdities that Chandrakirti gives, and I know what you're talking about. I wanted to clarify, I'll make sure, but yeah. So this is a useful point to talk about because somebody had asked about the distinction between the Svadhantrika, the autonomous school, the Bhavaviveka system of interpreting Nagarjuna, versus Chandrakirti's system, the consequence school. And these are three verses from Chandrakirti's text, the supplement to the Middle Way, are specifically targeting this view of Bhavaviveka. He's targeting the view that Bhavaviveka holds that although things do not exist truly, they have an inherent existence. And what this means is that at the conventional level, there's something findable. We can establish an agreed upon conventional existence that from both of our perspectives exists. So what this means is that anything we can talk about conventionally, we can pinpoint it. So if I talk about, for example, a chariot, this is the example that Chandrakirti uses. What is a chariot? Well, Bhavaviveka would say, yes, a chariot is a collection of the parts of the chariot. There's the wheel, there's the I'm not sure actually what you'd say about a chariot, the front shield, I guess you might say. There's the reins, all these different parts. And the collection of that is conventionally a chariot, and we all agree on that. Ultimately, it's not established. And why? Because when we take it apart, we can't, it doesn't withstand analysis. It's composed of parts that are not a chariot. The wheels itself are not a chariot. The atomic particles are not chariots. So it doesn't exist in an ultimate way. It also depends on causes, and it depends on other things to make it a chariot. However, conventionally speaking, these parts of the chariot are a chariot. This is its conventional nature. Now, Chandrakirti says that what you call the conventional nature of the chariot is actually the object of negation. So his analysis of emptiness is very different. Rather than at first establishing its conventional mode of abidance and agreeing on that, and then debating about the ultimate nature of that, he says this immediate appearance to you is wrong. So Bhavaviveka's system, the appearance to our sense consciousness is right. It's just how it is. It's this conceptual overlay that's a problem. But Chandrakirti says that actually you're going too far. Right away, what's appearing to you is wrong. And so I like to say that Chandrakirti likes to ask annoying questions. So Bhavaviveka will say, yes, this is the chariot. Conventionally, it's so. Well, Chandrakirti will say, what do you mean this is the chariot? If these parts of the chariot, well, if the wheel, if the cart, all the parts of the chariot are the chariot, then how are they the parts of the chariot? Because the chariot and the parts are the same thing. So how can the chariot possess its parts? How can something possess parts when the parts are the thing? Or likewise, if the wheel breaks, then there's no more chariot because all the parts aren't there. You said all the parts are the chariot, didn't you? Or if I only see the front of the chariot, I don't see the chariot because I only see part of the chariot, but you said all the parts of the chariot. Or if all the parts of the chariot, then there's many chariots because there's many parts. So Bhavaviveka would not like this. He would say, just shut up and let's agree that's a chariot. That's all. And now let's get to analyzing its existence. But Chandrakirti would say at the very first level, you can't define what a chariot really is. We can only talk about it in terms of worldly renown. If we really try to pinpoint it, we'll never find it. And this comes back to this example I gave by David Hume, which I think is spot on in this context. I don't know if David Hume was a reincarnation of Chandrakirti. I don't think so, but it's a very similar kind of reasoning. So David Hume says that if we have a boat, that's a wooden boat, and every year we replace one plank, in 20 years, all the planks are new. Is it still the same boat? So in Chandrakirti's system, conventionally speaking, it's the same boat, that's all. The parts of the boat were never the boat in the first place. But in Bhavaviveka's system, this is a problem because he said all those parts are the boat. So if all the parts are gone, there's all these new parts, then it should be a different boat. But in the world, we don't say that. We don't say it's a new boat. We say it's the same boat. I still have the same boat I had 20 years ago. Likewise, I'm the same person I was 20 years ago, even though all my parts of my body are different. I mean, we might say, okay, I'm a very different person, like I've changed a lot, but We would not say, we'd have a distinction. Yes, I'm the same person as I was when I was 10 years old. My friend Namjong here is not me from 10 years old. There's a different person. I'm Tenzin Gache, and I'm the same. I'm Tenzin Gache who was here yesterday and was here last year. Conventionally so. Whereas if in the middle of the night somebody came and stole the boat and replaced it with an identical boat, I might think it's the same boat, but actually we'd say, no, it's a different boat. You're just wrong. You know, how is that exactly any different than having replaced all the parts? Well, it's really inherently we can't make any distinction, but conventionally it's the same boat. Whereas when we stole the boat and put a new one in, it's a different boat. So this is the argument that Chandrakirti is leveling against Bhavaviveka. And so in order to negate Bhavaviveka's view, he gives these three verses that you referenced. These absurd consequences of if things had an inherent existence, then there would be absurd consequences. And so the first one, he says, Gelde rangitseni dengirna de la cording opa jikpechir, toning opa jipegirgirna, deni mirik techer de yu min, which means if this thing depended on an inherent establishment, then you would denigrate emptiness. And therefore, if emptiness was the cause of this thing disintegrating, well, that doesn't work. So therefore, it's not inherently established. So he's saying that if you accept that something is inherently established and that conventionally it's findable under analysis, but ultimately you don't find it. Well, therefore, when an Arya being analyzes the existence of something, they don't find it. So they're thereby destroying its conventional existence, because first it was found and then it was not found. So it's as though, rather than emptiness being a quality that was there from the beginning, it's that the analysis destroys its existence. Because you said that it exists inherently, and then somebody searches for it and they don't find it. So it changes. It first existed and then it didn't exist. But emptiness, or the view, the understanding of emptiness, cannot destroy something that was already there. And Chandrakirti quotes the Buddha saying, emptiness does not make things empty. Things are already empty from their own nature. But in Bhavaviveka's system, it sounds as though he's saying that things exist in the first place, but then emptiness comes along and destroys them. I'm not sure he'd agree with that, but Chandrakirti says this is what your system is really saying. And then in the second verse, he says, Gancheng opo derakni, deni namper chepa, ngoleni, yini mayan dechir jiktenki tani dela namper chemicha. Which means that if these things, these conventionally, these things in the world, deni ngole suruldu. So if other than their final nature of emptiness, if there was some findable nature other than that, let's see. Yeah, then it's not found under analysis. When a yogi analyzes things, he doesn't find it. And Bhavaviveka would agree with that. The yogi who analyzes the nature of something does not find this conventional mode of abidance. It's only found under what he calls conventional analysis. But you're saying that there's two different findable things there. That there's what you find under ultimate analysis and what you find under conventional analysis. But you shouldn't divide them into that. You don't find, when you search for it, you only find one thing. There's not something other than the ultimate level of ultimate mode of abidance that you find that's conventional. So therefore, worldly conventions only exist without being analyzed. If you analyze, you'll destroy them. You cannot find something under analysis on a conventional level. It's like saying, I want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to say that ultimately I can't find them, but conventionally I can find them. It's like, what are you talking about? What do you mean by conventional versus ultimate analysis? It's simply that you analyze them and you don't find them. You can't make this arbitrary distinction between this is conventional analysis, this is ultimate analysis. It's just analysis. If you search for it, you don't find it. And then third verse, Deni gapsu ripa gangchiki, dakdan shenlikipa rikminpe. Dani doing rikma me your way. Oh yeah. So basically, it's saying when you analyze things, you search for whether it arises from self or other. We had this talk earlier. So you would say, does it arise from self? Does it arise from other? You don't find either of them. Oh yeah. So kyugi kewa gangi impergyur. So he's saying that if it existed inherently, it would have to exist inherently either as inherently born from self or inherently born from other. But we don't find either of those. So what thing is left over that can be inherently existent? It's not findable either as born from self. It's not findable as born from other. So in the context of that, there's nothing left at all. So your idea that there's some kind of inherent existence, again, is untenable, given that you yourself accept Nagarjuna's reasoning, which says that things are not born from self and not born from other. Now, Bhavaviveka would respond that they conventionally are born from self, but they're they conventionally are born from other, but they're not ultimately born from other. But again, Chandrakirti would say that you can't make that distinction. They're either born from self or not, born from other or not born from other. They can't be conventionally so, but not ultimately so, because though some things, like we say, conventionally things exist, they don't ultimately exist. But the difference is that existence is something that's renowned in the world. In the world, we talk about, I have a friend and he exists. I have this or that thing. It's just a worldly convention. Whereas birth from other is not a worldly convention. It's not the way people talk in the world. It necessitates that you search for it. You find something that's inherently other than the thing. That's what is meant by birth from other. It's not just talking about a son is born from the mother. It's talking about that there are two inherently unrelated things, and that one gives birth to the other, and that is not findable under analysis. So these three absurd consequences are the three absurd consequences to Bhavaviveka saying that things exist conventionally in a findable way. So this really comes to the heart of what's the difference between Chandrakirti's philosophy and Bhavaviveka's philosophy. So next, I have this question. The reflection in the mirror example is used by Sautantrikas with respect to mistaken view of seeing things as autonomous, substantial, real. By Chittamatras to show the mistaken view of externally real and Madhyamakas as inherently real. Can you please use this example of the reflection to show the difference in subtlety between these views? So I think by Sadtantrika, you mean Svatantrika. Is that right? Bhavaviveka system. Just type it in if I'm right. Are you there? Okay, you see me in Dharmakirti system. Okay. Well, basically, we have the different schools. So they all use similar examples for things. Sometimes this is a point of confusion. People hear that, okay, the Madhyamaka, for example, Prasankika Chandrakirti school, they prefer to use the example of a rope and a snake that uses the mistake a rope for being a snake. Whereas in Shantarakshita's school, he likes to use the example of an illusory horse, that a magician creates an illusion of a horse to illustrate emptiness. And then in the Chittamacha, the mind-only school, they like to use the example of a dream. And then in the Sautrantika, the school of Dharmakirti, he might use the example of a mirror to illustrate the way that thought consciousness is mistaken. But actually, it's nothing to do with these different examples having different meanings. It has to do with how the people interpret the meaning. So it's not that the illusory horse is closer to the Svatantrika view and that the rope as a snake is closer to the Prasangika view. It's simply that how they interpret that analogy, or that how they interpret that example. So they would all agree that things are like a reflection in a mirror, but in a different way. So in Dharmakirti's system, he would say that the appearance to thought consciousness is like a reflection in a mirror. But when things appear to sense consciousness, this is simply the way they exist in a real way. So it's distinguishing between thought consciousness and sense consciousness, or direct perception. Whereas in the mind-only or Chittamatra school, they would say that a mirror, things exist like a reflection in a mirror, even to sense consciousness, because when you look in a mirror, if you stand in front of a mirror and you see objects that seem to be very far away because they're behind you very far away, but in front of you in the mirror, they seem to be very far away. But actually, they're right in front of you. The mirror is right there. Likewise, things in the world appear to be far away from us. But actually, it's only a reflection. It's only has to do with our perception. They only exist in the space of consciousness. There's no inherent far away and an external level. And likewise, things appear to us to be unrelated or cut off. It's the word they use. It means they're unrelated to our minds. It seems to us that the world we experience has no relation to us as the experiencer, but actually it's merely a reflection of our own mind. So they use this as an example to show that there's no external world. It's all just appearances within the space of consciousness. Whereas the Svatantrika, the Baba Viveka system, and also Santo Dakshita's system, we say the autonomous Madhyamaka or autonomous middle way, for them, this is an example of how things only exist by appearing to consciousness. So it's not that they are, at least in Bhavaviveka system, they're not actually consciousness. They're not actually one nature with consciousness. But we can only conceive of something as existing in a relation to something else. So it has to appear to consciousness to exist. So, for example, if I think, yesterday I saw a movie, or maybe rather than a movie, but a more concrete example. Yesterday I saw an elephant. I can't possibly conceive of an elephant without conceiving of a consciousness experiencing the elephant. So it depends on appearing to mind. The elephant does not exist without appearing to mind. So everything in the universe, it can only exist if there is mind to which it appears. So in this sense, when we conceive of something, we think of it as having some kind of existence that has no relation to mind, to appearing to a mind. But this is mistaken. Nothing can exist except in relation to appearing to a mind. In that sense, it's like a reflection in a mirror, which can only be perceived by somebody seeing it. If you stand on the side, if you stand to my right side and look in the mirror, you won't see my reflection because it will be angled differently. So it depends on where I'm looking and how I see it in order for that reflection even to exist. Now, in the Prasangika school, the consequent school of Chandrakirti is even subtler. It's not just that it requires appearance to a mind, it requires a concept. It requires a conceiving of something as existing. So like in the example of the chariot, there's no such thing as a chariot until I come up with that concept. There's nothing in the external world or anywhere that corresponds to my conception. There's no referent for the term that I can locate because it's just a term that I made up. So we might have an argument about this. sometimes this happens between nations. The United States, when they first made their boundaries on their map, then they said this is the United States. And then there were other countries like Mexico who made boundaries and they overlapped. So Mexico would say, no, this is Mexico. And the United States would say, this is the United States. Well, both of these are just based on somebody's concept. So you're not going to win the argument either way because you're arguing from different perspectives. On my map, which I drew, this is part of Mexico. But on your map, which you drew, this is part of the United States. But it didn't exist as either of those a priori to our deciding that through our concepts. So everything, like in that sense, is like a reflection of our concepts. So in that sense, it's like a reflection of a mirror. So you see that it's just to say it's a reflection in a mirror isn't enough. We have to understand how it's like a reflection. And all of these different people have different concepts of what that means. Okay. So now I've finished the questions that I had. If anyone has any other questions, we can take them now.
Venerable, I have a question, follow-up question from the question I asked about the mirror.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So the Chittamatans would also say that the Chittamatans would say also that something is empty of being the true referent of the label.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So they also have this thing that they say. So when we say that, when we look at the mirror example with the Prasangikas, and we say that it's a concept that's required before or a label that's required, we have to make the word chariot up to say it's a chariot.
Yes.
So what would be the difference between what the Chittamatans
that's
would
a very
say
good question.
empty?
Yeah. So the Chittamatans have this concept where they say that something does not exist as the referent for conceptual consciousness, or the basis for the adherence of conceptual consciousness. Now, this is actually not so clear. Tsongkhapa was the first Tibetan to recognize that the Chittamatans say this. He recognized this in the philosophy of Asanga, in his texts Bodhisattva Bhumi, and also Tenlawapa Dua. I don't actually know the Sanskrit name for that, but that's compendium of ascertainments. In these texts, that Asanga was talking about something other than just this emptiness that we often understand in the Chittamatra school, that there is the emptiness of the substantial difference between subject and object. And so Kappa said, actually, they have another way of understanding emptiness. It's really it's really another side of the same thing. But what it means is that they have the idea that we talk about the meaning generality. So when we have a conceptual consciousness, I talked about this earlier, there's an appearance of just a general thing. I think about a pot, and it's like a mix of all the pots that I've experienced. So, but in the system of the Sautantrika, this is not something that appears to direct perception. It's only a thought consciousness. But in the system of the Chittamatrans, this actually, because of our strong adherence to this since beginningless time, then therefore external things also, this appears along with them. So when I see a pot, then also what appears to my eye consciousness is this basis of conceptual thought, which is like a meaning generality almost, which is why I then have the thought, this is a pot. Otherwise, I wouldn't have that thought. And then one of the arguments they use for that is that somebody who doesn't know the word pot, they don't just immediately think this is a pot. But somebody who does know it's a pot, they don't have to have any kind of conceptual analysis. It just immediately appears to my mind, oh, a pot. Or even, anything, if I'm attracted to a particular person, I don't have to register, oh, it's that person. Oh, I like her, I'm attracted to her. That's already been the case. And even if I don't register consciously that I'm seeing the person, I mean, this is in modern science we found, but I think this is very much correlated with the Chittamatran school. You can measure the person's physical reaction, and there's arousal in the body, even though they don't consciously register that they've seen the person. So there's some kind of immediate reaction to that based on our previous concepts of it. So this, according to the Chittamatra school, this shows that there's some kind of appearance to the sense consciousness that is based on imprints in the mind, and not just based on what's coming from the side of the object. So therefore, I like to some examples I like to think about that I think illustrate this. You might remember from the Mind Life conference at Sarah about 5 years ago. I think Pavin Singh was the presenter who talked about the people who have been blind since birth, and then they restore their eyesight, and then they show them a picture of like a cow, for example, and they say, now outline all the different figures here. And because the cow has spots, they outline as though the spots on the cow are different figures, because their mind has not yet attuned to this being a singular thing. So we take this for granted. We see the world as discrete entities. You see me right now, you see this as one object. You don't see glasses and head and arms as separate things, but you see this television screen behind me as something separate. This is coming from imprints in the mind of conceiving of things as separate. So the adherence to true existence in this case is that to adhere to this appearance to mind as to be coming from the side of the object. And this relates to their adherence to external existence, because when you see things also, you have this sense that there's a divide between me and the external world. Just like you have a divide between my body here and the television screen there, there's a sense of some kind of barrier between your consciousness experiencing things and the external thing that's there. So it appears that there's an external world separate from consciousness, but that only has to do with our habituation to thinking about self and other. Actually, there's no boundary between the consciousness experiencing it and the external world. However, this is different than the Madhyamaka, or at least the Prasangika view, because it's not saying that the bases of designation do not constitute the thing. It's a different concept. The bases of designation of Tenzin Gache, they would say, the body, the mind, the collection of these are actually, in their view, the all-ground consciousness is the real person. But in any case, there's something findable among the bases of designation that is the person. Even though it appears in a distorted way, nevertheless, it's a real thing. So like the TV screen, there's a real TV screen, but it doesn't exist apart from consciousness. It's different than analyzing the basis of designation. It has to do with analyzing the way the imprints in the mind create our experience of things. The other example I wanted to mention that I'd like to use in this case, it also came from the Mind Life conference, actually. I got a lot out of that. There was the Russian lady, I forget her name. I think actually she was based in America, maybe Russian born. But anyway, she gave, I thought, an excellent presentation about perceptions. And she gave a lot of different examples. And one of these was of Aborigines in Australia. And their, how, for example, when we conceive of things, we think of right and left. So when we write, we write a sentence, we write from left to right, just habitually. And we take for granted that we're always in this frame of reference of right and left. But from their experiments with their Aboriginal people, they don't have that concept. They're habituated to thinking about north and east and south and west. And at all times, no matter what direction they're facing, even if it's dark, they know where north and south and east and west are, which normal, the normal people, the people like us cannot, we can't recognize that without some kind of reference point. And then when they ask the Aboriginal children to draw something, to write something, depending on which direction, cardinal direction they're facing, it will be different. They always write north to south. So if they're facing south, they write downwards. And if they're facing north, they write, upwards or whatever. And also there's an example of how people in Australia, these native people were once, one of the teachers at Sarah, actually, one of the Australian monks told me that there was a time when they had constructed some kind of low-income housing for some Aboriginal people who were not very well off, and they had never lived in houses before, and so they came back later and they had basically destroyed the house because they'd lit fires inside the house and knocked down the walls, because they didn't have any concept of inside. This is something, again, that we take for granted. Right now I'm inside and I behave very differently. The way I hold my body and the way I speak, I don't just wave my arms around because I'm careful, I don't want to break anything. Whereas if I'm outside, you'll notice I speak differently and I hold my body differently. This just has to do with a particular concept that appears to us as if it's a real thing, but it just has to do with our conceptual overlay on our experience. So I think this again relates to the Chittamatra understanding that our experience of our world is inner, outer, left and right, all of these things, they just depend upon our particular way of conceiving of things. But they actually distorts, just the raw data of what's there. Okay.
So, Venerable, a follow-up on that. How much of those distortions are actually learned in this lifetime versus habit energies from a previous lifetime?
That's a very good question. In the Chittamatra system, it's a mixture of both. But one of the main distinctions is that they talk about the bases of a label versus the bases of conceptual thought. And the basis of the label is only from this lifetime. So if I have the example of words, a TV, I see a TV screen, and immediately I think TV screen. That only comes from having had that thought in this life. It's not from having learned the language in this life. Otherwise, a newborn baby would immediately see a TV screen and think TV screen. But the basis of conceptual thought can come from both this life and the last life. So I could learn certain things in this life and then have conceptual thoughts about something, but also I could have imprints from past lives. And again, coming back to this Life conference, because I remember this point too, they had the question of, why is it that newborn babies, when they see their mother smile, they smile back to her? This is actually a mystery, because how do they know that a smile means happiness and that the response to that should be a smile? So one answer to that would be that, well, they were babies in a past life, or they were humans in a past life, and they have that response. Whereas, from what I surmise, some people don't have that reaction. We have people who are considered severely autistic and don't react to human faces. This could be the result of lack of habituation with that in a previous life. We have I think Temple Grandin, the famous autistic woman in America, I think there was how she had this intuitive understanding of how cows suffer, the experience of suffering that they have, and therefore how to make them the slaughter of cows more humane. This would then fit very well with the possibility that she was a cow before, and thereby both in this life has an intuitive sense of cows and doesn't have a very intuitive sense of human interactions. We look at it when we see, when I came to the monastery for the first time, again, one of my teachers, one of the Australian teacher in my house, he said to me, when I first got to the monastery, I thought all the Tibetans had the same face. But after being here many years, they all look different to me. This is because we're not habituated with that. And when we look at dogs, they all look the same to us, but to dogs, they probably look very different, their face. This has to do with habituation. So things we're habituated to in a past life, we might then be habituated to in this life, especially with language. This is another question. How do we learn language? Some of you might know what's called the paucity of stimulus. This is a big argument within the linguistic field, that the amount of stimulation in terms of language that young children receive is far too little for them to be able to learn grammar and syntax of language, yet children learn grammar and syntax in language and are quite accurate. Young children who talk, they may make mistakes in their language, but they generally make a lot less mistakes than they should, given how little exposure to language they have. And so, there was a big question about this. Some of you might know, Noam Chomsky came up with this idea of a universal language instinct that thereby somehow could explain this, but that's been basically disproven because it's problematic, that because all languages are very different syntactically. So to have some kind of pre-programmed language instinct that fits all languages doesn't work. So then there becomes a problem. Where does this come from? And one person I know suggested, I think very pertinently here, that if somebody knew a language in the last life, then it's very easy to learn. And therefore, they don't need so much stimulation. Whereas, of course, there are some children who just fail to pick up the language. Maybe they didn't know it before. And there's some people, we know this in the monastery, coming to the Tibetan monastery, that some of us as foreigners learn Tibetan very easily. And some of us, like me, I learned literary Tibetan very easily, but colloquial Tibetan was very difficult. It doesn't necessarily have to do with how intelligent you are. There's just different imprints that somebody might have that make things, that's not like you immediately understand it. You don't just hear Tibetan and immediately know it. But when you start learning it, it just comes very naturally. This is something that the Chittamatra school, the mind-only schools, explicitly talks about these imprints in the mind and how they function. I think it's actually very useful to consider. Sometimes we might hear that the Madhyamaka school, the middle way school, is the highest view, and therefore we don't really take the other ones seriously. But it's really useful to consider these other schools, because they have a lot of insights. They see things from a different point of view. And so in the Chittamatra school, the idea of imprints and how they function from life to life, it's very clearly laid out, especially in Asanga. You're the main author of the Chittamatra texts. Okay. Okay.
If
Go ahead.
no one else has a question, can I ask another one? I don't want to hog all the questions. So
it's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
If someone else doesn't have, then I can ask. Oh, he's asked. Somebody else has asked. Yeah.
Okay. Can I expound on stream enters? Okay. So again, I don't know everyone's background in terms of Buddhist philosophy. So sometimes, I might be using a lot of terms that people don't know. So I apologize for that. But just briefly, I've used the distinction between Hinayana and Mahayana. So we have the Hinayana path that leads to the self-liberation of an arhat. Arhat is a noble one. It's a term for a liberated being. Versus the Mahayana path leads to the full enlightenment of a Buddha, which is a more advanced realization. So if someone is following the Hinayana path, then in that case, they have different stages of realization that they go through that the Buddha described. So in this case, generally speaking, there are 4 main levels of realization. So the first one is called stream enter. It's still a very advanced level of realization, but this means somebody first has a direct perception of emptiness. So I think I said the first day, they enter the stream, and this carries them to the ocean of liberation. Once they've entered the stream, they're definite to achieve it because they're on their way, they're in the stream. But it will take time. It says it can take between 1 to 14 lifetimes from when they first have direct perception of emptiness. Then the next level is what's called once returner, where they've abandoned the greater part of the afflictions related to the desire realm. So they can only possibly be born one more time in the desire realm, which means in a coarse physical body, as a human being, a hell being. Well, they actually won't be born as a hell being because they're an Arya being, but they'll be born only one more time as either a human or as a desire realm god. And then the next stage is when they achieve what's called non-returner. So they've abandoned all afflictions related to the desire realm, so that they can no longer be reborn in the desire realm. But they have not abandoned all afflictions, and they have very subtle afflictions that can cause them to be born as a form realm or formless realm being. But then when they abandon those, then they achieve arhatship, which is liberation, and they will not be born again due to karma and afflictions. So the stream enter is the first stage of that. So the effects of karmic imprints also in Prasangika. So first of all, absolutely yes. All Buddhist schools agree that karma is functions through imprints. Now, if you have a chance, I mentioned about the 70 stanzas talk I gave. In the opening talk, I talked a lot about that point because I think that's often missed in this discussion of emptiness. Really what all the schools are arguing about, the main point is, how does karma work? The Buddha said very clearly that there is karma, but he didn't make it clear philosophically how that works. That leaves a big open question. So what most of these schools are arguing about is, what is karma and how does it function? So what is a karmic imprint and where is it stored and how? So Prasangika has a very subtle and unique way of presenting what an imprint is, but they totally agree that there are imprints and that there's karma. And all the imprints I talked about in the Chittamatra, the mind-only school, they talk about them too in the Prasangika. However, actually the level of detail about the different kinds of imprints is more clear in the Chittamatra presentation. And the Prasangika, they just don't bother to address that because they agree with it. They don't disagree with that there's all these different kinds of imprints. They just agree with what an imprint is and where it's stored. So that's the main point that they're trying to discuss. But they wouldn't disagree with that there are basically what they call 4 kinds of imprints, which are the imprints of similar type, the imprints of language, the imprints of the bases of the limbs of existence, and the imprints of there's also uncontaminated imprint, the Buddha nature, which is also considered an imprint in the mind. So in that school, in the Chittamatra school, they talk about all these different kinds of imprints, but the Prasangika wouldn't reject it. They would just talk about what is an imprint. They have a different conception of that. So, okay. I'd like to see some objects, meaning? Are you regarding? Okay, if you can still hear me, I've lost the screen, but that may have been my own mistake.
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, I've lost the entire screen somehow. I'm not so skilled with Zoom. But if you can just speak to me, I can hear you. I can't actually see the chat anymore.
Yeah, Venerable, ignore that point, like to see
Okay.
some objects, because I meant it in relation to the karmic imprints.
Okay. Okay, now I've got you back here. Okay. Okay.
So can I ask my question now?
Yes, please.
It's a bit difficult to type it out, so I'll just ask it. So my question is about dependent origination and emptiness.
Okay.
One is a positive phenomena, one is a non-affirming negative phenomena.
Okay.
But dependent origination is easier to experience, to at least even for beginners, it's not that difficult to experience. However, emptiness and non-affirming negative is far more difficult, as you also said earlier in the first part of the talk on the first day, that the mind is not used to seeing a non-affirming negative. What appears to the mind is always a positive phenomena. So, but the emptiness is considered the liberating part.
Yes.
And not dependent origination.
That's right.
So why then this emphasis on form is emptiness, emptiness is form? Always saying that, oh, it's the same thing, it's just two sides of the same coin.
Well, first of all, 2 sides of the same coin doesn't mean the same, right? If you see one side of the coin, you don't see the other side. But beyond that analogy, the point here is that emptiness and dependent arising, they're not actually the same thing. They're not what we call synonymous, right? Something that is dependently arisen is not emptiness. It's empty of inherent existence, but they're similar, but not in the same way that, for example, impermanence and functioning thing are synonymous. It's not the same, because emptiness is again a non-affirming negation, and a pot is a dependent arising. A pot is not emptiness. However, emptiness is not other than the pot either, because it's one nature with the pot. So when we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form, it's to get us away from this view that I was mentioning earlier, that emptiness is somehow something other. It's like behind you clear away all the dependent phenomena, and then behind that is emptiness. Because emptiness is merely the absence of inherent existence of a pot. You can't talk about emptiness without something that is empty. But you don't necessarily see that nature of it, but just by seeing it physically. You see the dependent arising. You see something changing moment to moment. You see it coming from causes. You see it's composed of parts that appears to your eye consciousness. The emptiness of it is something that does not appear to our ordinary senses. However, it doesn't exist apart from that thing either. It's the ultimate nature of that thing. It's what you find when you analyze that thing with analysis, conceptually. And then ultimately, that conceptual realization will turn into a direct perception. Now, this is actually unique in the Tsongkhapa system. A lot of the other Tibetan schools, especially like Gorampa's presentation, would say that this is like a break from an ordinary experience, that when you have a direct perception of emptiness, you're perceiving something that you've not actually conceptually realized before, because you can't have a conceptual realization of emptiness. It's beyond our conceptual ability to conceive of such a thing. It's beyond, he says, the four extremes. So you just have to use conceptions to basically negate all other possibilities of how it could exist. And then eventually, by abiding in that absence of any conception at all, then you have this direct experience of something totally other. And Tsongkhapa accuses this view of particularly being against this point of form as emptiness, emptiness is form. They have a different way of understanding that. Whereas in Tsongkhapa's system, you gain a conceptual understanding of that thing. And then you keep meditating on that conceptual understanding until it appears to your direct perception. This is actually based on Dharmakirti's philosophy, that Tsongkhapa carries over Dharmakirti's philosophy into the Madhyamaka system. And in Dharmakirti's philosophy, he has the example of somebody who has an hallucination. So somebody who is very attached to a woman will keep thinking about her all the time. And eventually he'll start dreaming about her. And then eventually he'll even start hallucinating her in waking consciousness. This can happen if people are so focused on one object. So in a similar way, this is a wrong consciousness, but emptiness is a right consciousness. And if you keep focusing on it with conceptual concentration, eventually it will appear to direct perception, because this is just a natural quality of the mind, that something that has been habituated with will eventually appear naturally without having to put any effort into it. So eventually, even though it's only a conceptual not construct, but conceptual understanding at the beginning, eventually it will appear to direct perception. But at the initial stages, when we see a pot, we only see the dependent arising. We don't see the nature of emptiness. However, they're the same also in that, and dependent arising, the word dependent means that it is not independent. So it's negating independence, which is similar to emptiness negating some kind of independent existence. So there are different ways of understanding the same thing, even though they're not exactly the same thing. I think, I don't know, was there another point? I forget your original question.
No. I think this is what I was asking. My thing was, when dependent arising is so much easier to realize, and why not?
That's why His Holiness says, His Holiness often says that we should start with that. That's the best way to access emptiness. If we just think empty, 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 we'll fall into nihilism, because we don't really get the point of what it's saying. But dependent arising, we can start with dependence on causes. I talked about this in the 70 stanzas talk about somebody asked me how to start how to start meditating on emptiness, I think the first step is to meditate on causes and conditions. To think that what we call a person really depends on a lot of causes and conditions. So this can help us not to get angry at somebody when we think about how this person is acting this particular way, based on causes beyond their control, based on their upbringing, based on their life experience, based on their karma. And this is a beginning of an understanding of emptiness, because you start to recognize that there's no inherent person who's doing these things, who's having these thoughts. It's all based on causes and conditions that aren't really a person in themselves. And then we have dependence on parts, and then we have the more subtle kind of dependent arising, which is dependence on labeling concepts. But in any case, it leads naturally to the understanding that there's not something inherent and stable and fixed there. It's something that depends on a lot of other factors. Okay. Smitha had a question, I see.
No, Venerable, I asked.
Oh,
I just
yeah,
asked sometime
okay.
back, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, as I've mentioned, unless anyone else has any questions right now, I'm happy to continue answering questions in an online form if people want to submit them, I guess, to Shanti, and then she can let me know and we can post them on some kind of online forum. I apologize, there might be some delay because being in quarantine here, I don't have any personal access to email. I have to borrow Venerable Namjung's computer and his internet access, so I don't want to make too much use of that. But maybe once a day I can make responses that people want to submit, over the next week or so. I'm happy to do that. So in any case, yeah, it seems like there's no more questions now. So thank you all. I'm glad to have this opportunity. As I mentioned, my hope was to teach these different short texts of Nagarjuna, because it helps me also to have to prepare. In the monastery, we study Chandrakirti's work directly. We don't actually study Nagarjuna's texts independently. So it's very useful to have the opportunity to read through them and the commentaries on them. So now I've done 70 stanzas on emptiness and 60 stanzas on reasoning. We still have, there's first of all root wisdom, which I don't think I can teach in an online course because it's too long. And there's precious Garland is the same way. Maybe I could go through that a little bit, but it would be good to go through the finally woven and the speller or disputes at some point, maybe next year. It would be helpful to, for me to be able to read about those texts a little more and then try to present them. So let's just see what happens. I hope you all have a nice winter. We'll be in quarantine here. We'll be in quarantine here for, I think, 3 weeks. I'm not sure if this is scientifically accurate, but even if we test negative, we still have to stay in quarantine for 3 weeks. This is the rule. And then we have to give our exams. And then I'll be in retreat, I hope, for a couple of months. So maybe sometime next year, we can do that. So thank you all. So I see you there, Shanti. Did you have something to say, or do you want to do the dedication?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Venerable.
Yeah.
Yes, and please teach very soon.
Thank you.
We really benefited from your teaching. Thank you to everyone who participated and also for your donations. We have some programs organized coming up. A Tara retreat in January 2nd and 3rd. Vajrakata Sutra commentary by Venerable Namjongla, the end of January. And we have Discovering Buddhism, the Path to Enlightenment, third module by Venerable Robina in February, all the Fridays of February. So do join and keep in touch. Thank you very much. Have a good holiday season.
Thank you. So do we want to do the dedication prayers now?
Sure.
Okay. So
thank you, Venerable. Before that, this is the first time I attended one of your teachings. I missed the last one.
Okay.
So
Well,
it was,
yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Thank you for being here. We can provide the recording if you like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Shantiji
yeah.
sent the
Yeah, good.
links.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was
Um,
really good.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So here we have the dedication. May the precious supreme bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. Samsara and nirvana lack even an atom of inherent existence, and cause and effect independent arising are unbetraying. I seek your blessings to discern the meaning of Nagarjuna's thought, that these two are mutually complementary and not contradictory. However many sick sentient beings there are, may they quickly be freed from all sicknesses. May all the sicknesses without exception of transmigrating beings never occur again. In all my lives, never separated from perfect gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma, and by completing the qualities of the grounds and paths, may I quickly obtain the state of Vajradhara. By the force of the victorious one, Tsongkhapa, acting as my direct Mahayana virtuous friend in all my lives, may I never turn away for even a second from the pure path highly admired by the victorious ones. May I and all sentient beings meet the teachings of the victorious one Losang Dragpa, who lived an eminent life endowed with pure morality, a brave heart in doing the Bodhisattva's extensive deeds, and the yoga of the two stages, the supreme transcendental wisdom of non-dual bliss and voidness. Like the earth, water, fire, and wind, medicines and wood in the forest, may I always be enjoyed by all sentient beings as I like and without resistance. May I hold sentient beings as dear as my life. May sentient beings hold me most dear. May all their negative karma ripen on me, and may all my virtue ripen on them. As long as any sentient being has not been liberated from samsara, may I abide in samsara to help them, even though I achieve highest enlightenment. May I become a wish-granting jewel, fulfilling all the wishes, and like a wish-granting tree, fulfilling all the hopes of transmigratory beings. By merely seeing, hearing, thinking about, or remembering me, as well as by touching me or talking to me, may all suffering instantly be pacified, and may there be happiness forever. Due to all the past, present, and future merits collected by me, the numberless Buddhas, the numberless sentient beings, which are completely empty of existence from their own side, may I, who am completely empty of existence from my own side, to the state of full enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side, and all sentient beings who are completely empty and existing from their own side, that state is completely empty of existing from its own side by myself alone, who am completely empty and existing from my own side. I fully dedicate all these virtues to be able to train just like the hero Manjushri who knows reality as it is, and just like Samandra Bhaddra as well. I fully dedicate all these roots of virtue with a dedication praise as best by all the gone beyond victorious ones of the three times in order to have good conduct. May for the Dharma King Tsongkhapa's way of Dharma to flourish, may all signs of obstacles be pacified and all conducive conditions be complete. Due to the two types of merit of the three times of myself and others, may the teachings of the victorious one Losang Dragpa shine resplendent forever. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every benefit, single benefit and happiness in this world, the incomparably kind Supreme Tenzin Gyatso, may you have a long life and may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjuna's victorious doctrine, who massively accomplished magnificent prayers, honoring the three sublime ones, savor of myself and others, your disciples, please live long. Okay, so thank you, everybody. See you again.